Welcome back to the show, everyone.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Today we're diving into a fascinating book called Misbelief. What makes rational people believe irrational things?
Interesting title.
It is. It's by Dan Ariely, a behavioral economist.
Okay.
And it's really about, all those times when we find ourselves believing things that just don't seem to make sense.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Right? Like those moments when you realize you've been scrolling through social media for like an hour.
Oh, yeah.
And you're like, wait, how did I even get here?
Totally. This book is all about those mental autopilots, the hidden forces that shape our beliefs, even when we think we're being totally logical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Ariely kicks off the book with a story that really grabbed me. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he found himself targeted by some pretty out there conspiracy theories.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, and these weren't just your everyday run-of-the-mill theories. I mean, people were accusing him of orchestrating the whole pandemic.
Oh, orchestrating it. That's intense.
Yeah, and it got even crazier. They were saying he was profiting from it and even wanted to harm children.
That's just awful. Like, how do people even come up with that stuff?
I know, right? It was completely baseless and obviously not true. But it really shook him up. He even started receiving death threats.
Oh, my gosh. That's terrifying.
It was. He talks about how it was this surreal experience for him because as a behavioral economist, he studies human behavior for a living.
So he's like the expert on this stuff.
Exactly. And yet here he was being targeted by these irrational beliefs.
So it's kind of a case of the expert becoming the experiment.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was a real wake-up call for him. He realized that anyone, even someone who studies human behavior, can fall prey to these mental traps.
So like nobody is immune.
Nobody is immune. So the big question is, what does Ariely say causes us to fall for these misbeliefs? What takes us down that rabbit hole?
Well, one of the first things he points to is stress and lack of control. That feeling of being overwhelmed by events and just not knowing what to do.
Yeah, like when everything feels chaotic and unpredictable.
Exactly. He actually uses this analogy of these experiments where dogs were given inescapable electric shocks.
Oh, those poor dogs. That sounds awful.
It was pretty rough, but it's a powerful illustration of how our brains respond to stress. You see, these dogs eventually learn to be helpless. Even when they had the opportunity to escape the shocks later on, they just gave up.
So they were so traumatized by the experience that they stopped even trying to get away.
Right. And Ariely argues that humans react in a similar way. When we're faced with unpredictable stress, like a global pandemic or a personal crisis, we scramble for explanations. We need something to make sense of the chaos, even if those explanations are completely irrational.
So it's like our brains are hardwired to find patterns even when they don't exist.
Yeah, we're pattern-seeking creatures. It's part of how we make sense of the world. But sometimes that tendency can lead us astray, especially when we're feeling stressed and out of control. We're more likely to grasp at those patterns even if they're flimsy or far-fetched.
And that makes us vulnerable to misbeliefs.
Exactly. Ariely connects this to what he calls the scarcity mindset.
Okay, scarcity mindset.
It's this idea that when we feel deprived of resources, whether it's time, money, social connection, or even a sense of control, it limits our ability to think clearly. Our cognitive bandwidth is overloaded, and we're more likely to grab onto quick and easy answers, even if they aren't the best ones.
So like when you're cramming for a deadline and you end up making impulsive decisions that you wouldn't normally make.
Exactly. That's scarcity mindset in action. You're so focused on the immediate problem that you don't have the mental energy to step back and see the bigger picture. And that can make you more susceptible to misinformation, especially when it comes in the form of compelling narratives.
So those stories that offer simple explanations and easy solutions are particularly tempting when we're feeling stressed and deprived.
Right. Our brains are naturally drawn to stories, especially those that offer clear villains and straightforward answers. It's like we're wired for drama.
We love a good hero versus villain story.
And in a way, we are. Think about how satisfying it is to pinpoint a bad guy, someone to blame for all the problems.
It gives us this false sense of control. Like if we could just expose these villains, everything would be okay.
But often those villains are just convenient scapegoats for complex issues.
It's easier to blame a person or a group than to grapple with the systemic factors that contribute to problems.
And sometimes those narratives play on our proportionality bias, this idea that big events must have proportionally big causes.
Proportionality bias. I've never heard of that.
It's basically this tendency to assume that big events must have big causes. For example, people might be more inclined to believe that Princess Diana was assassinated rather than accepting a more mundane explanation like a car accident. The assassination theory just feels more proportionate to her fame and the impact of her death.
Oh, I see. Our brains struggle to accept that sometimes big things happen for seemingly small or random reasons. We want a grand explanation to match the scale of the event.
Exactly. And this desire for a grand explanation makes us particularly susceptible to conspiracy theories, which often offer these intricate narratives that connect seemingly unrelated events.
So it's like those dot connecting puzzles where you see patterns that might not actually be there.
Right. And Ariely dives deep into this one particular example, the magnet theory, that took hold during the vaccine rollout.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. People were claiming that the COVID-19 vaccine was making them magnetic.
It sounds ridiculous, right? But it spread like wildfire online, fueled by anecdotal evidence and emotional appeals.
People were posting videos of spoons and other metal objects supposedly sticking to their skin after vaccination.
Right. It was prime example of how misbeliefs can be crafted and spread, especially when they tap into existing fears and anxieties. It was a classic case of confirmation bias. People were so afraid of the vaccine that they were willing to believe anything that confirmed their fears, even if it meant ignoring basic science.
It's like we're wired to trust our own senses and experiences even when they might be deceiving us.
Exactly. And Ariely points out that social media has created a perfect storm for spreading these kinds of misbeliefs. It's like an echo chamber where misinformation can bounce around and amplify itself.
It's like a breeding ground for conspiracy theories.
Yeah, algorithms prioritize content that triggers strong emotions, often at the expense of accuracy and nuance. So we end up seeing more and more of the stuff that confirms our biases, even if it's totally bogus.
And that makes it even harder to break free from those misbeliefs.
Right, it's like we're trapped in a filter bubble. Ariely argues that instead of trying to debunk misbeliefs directly, which can often backfire and make people dig in their heels even harder, we should focus on cultivating intellectual humility.
Intellectual humility. That sounds like a mouthful. What exactly does that mean?
It's basically the ability to admit you might be wrong, to be open to new information, and to change your mind when presented with evidence that contradicts your beliefs.
So it's the opposite of being stubborn and closed-minded.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have blind spots and that our understanding of the world is always evolving.
So it's like being okay with saying, I don't know, or I might be wrong.
Right. And Ariely even provides a questionnaire in the book to help people assess their own level of intellectual humility. He asks things like, do you reconsider your opinions when presented with new evidence? Or do you enjoy being proven wrong?
Okay, so if those questions make you squirm a little bit, you might need to work on your intellectual humility.
It's a great exercise in self-reflection. It can really help you see where you might be clinging to beliefs that are no longer serving you.
So if we can cultivate this intellectual humility, we'll be less likely to fall for misbeliefs.
It's not a foolproof solution, but it's definitely a good starting point. Ariely also suggests that we should be wary of information that evokes strong emotional reactions, particularly fear and anger.
Oh, yeah. Those emotions can really cloud our judgment. We might not even realize how much they're influencing our thinking.
He points out that misinformers often exploit these emotions to make their messages more compelling. They might use scare tactics or inflammatory language to grab your attention and bypass your critical thinking.
So it's like a manipulation tactic.
In a way, it is. They're using your emotions to short-circuit your reasoning abilities.
That's pretty sneaky.
No.
So how do we avoid falling for these emotional traps?
Ariely advises that we take a step back and ask ourselves, is this information appealing to my emotions or my logic?
If it's all about triggering fear or outrage, that's a red flag.
Exactly. Look for evidence-based arguments, not just emotional rhetoric.
And be wary of those heart-wrenching anecdotes or those viral videos that are designed to pull at your heartstrings.
They might be emotionally compelling, but they don't necessarily reflect the whole picture.
So it's about being more discerning with the information we consume, especially online.
Exactly. Ariely also emphasizes the importance of questioning authority figures, even those we respect and admire.
Now hold on. Aren't we supposed to trust experts?
To a certain extent, yes. But blind trust in any authority figure can be dangerous. Experts can be wrong, and they can have their own biases and agendas.
So it's not about rejecting expertise altogether. It's about being an informed skeptic.
Right. It's about evaluating the evidence for yourself, considering different perspectives, and forming your own informed conclusions.
Now, one thing that really struck me in the book is how Ariely delves into the role of social dynamics in spreading misbeliefs. It's not just about individual psychology. It's about how we interact with others.
Absolutely. Our social groups have a huge impact on our beliefs, even if we don't realize it.
It's like that saying, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Exactly. Ariely talks about the power of conformity, the pressure to fit in with a group, even if it means compromising our own values or
He
beliefs.
uses the example of the bird brigade movement. Remember that one?
The one where people claim that birds aren't real.
Yes, that they're all government surveillance drones in disguise. It was so bizarre, yet it gained a surprising amount of traction, especially among young people.
It became this sort of ironic inside joke, but it also highlighted how easily we can be swayed by groupthink, especially when it's presented in a humorous or subversive way.
It tapped into that teenage rebelliousness, that desire to question authority and be in on a secret that most people don't get.
Exactly. And it showed how social pressure can amplify even the most outlandish beliefs.
So how do we resist this pressure to conform, especially when it comes from people we care about or admire?
Ariely suggests surrounding yourself with people who value open-mindedness and respectful debate, even when they disagree with you. He also emphasizes the importance of being willing to stand up for your own beliefs, even if it means being the odd one out.
It takes courage to go against the grain, especially when you risk being ostracized or ridiculed.
It does. But Ariely argues that true belonging comes from authenticity, not conformity.
It's about finding your tribe, those people who respect you for who you are, even if you don't always see eye to eye.
Now, one of the most fascinating concepts Ariely explores is paradoxical persuasion.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. What's that all about?
It's this counterintuitive approach to persuading people who hold strong misbeliefs. Instead of directly contradicting their belief, you take their argument to its logical extreme.
So if someone says all politicians are corrupt, you might respond with, you're absolutely right, we should abolish the government altogether.
Exactly. By exaggerating their argument, you expose its flaws and potentially make them reconsider their position.
It's like using humor to disarm and enlighten. It avoids triggering that defensive reflex that often shuts down conversation.
Precisely. And it encourages people to think critically about their own beliefs rather than just digging in their heels.
Ariely admits that paradoxical persuasion doesn't always work. Some people are so entrenched in their beliefs that nothing will change their minds.
But it's a valuable tool to have in your arsenal, especially when dealing with those who are open to questioning their assumptions.
So it's about planting seeds of doubt rather than trying to win an argument.
Exactly. And sometimes those seeds can take root and lead to genuine shifts in perspective.
Now, throughout the book, Ariely keeps coming back to the importance of trust. He argues that the rise of misbeliefs is in part a symptom of a larger crisis of trust.
We live in a world where people have lost faith in institutions, experts, the media, even each other.
And when you don't trust anyone, you're more likely to believe anything.
It's a dangerous cycle. Distrust breeds misbeliefs, and misbeliefs further erode trust.
So what can we do to break this cycle?
Ariely emphasizes the importance of rebuilding trust, both on an individual and societal level. He doesn't offer a simple formula, but he does highlight the importance of starting with small acts of trust.
Like being honest and transparent in our interactions with others.
Exactly. And recognizing that trust is a two-way street. It requires vulnerability and a willingness to extend the benefit of the doubt.
He also suggests that we need to be more mindful of the language we use, especially online.
Instead of resorting to insults and accusations, we should strive for respectful dialogue even when we disagree.
It's about finding that balance between being critical and being compassionate.
He argues that this rebuilding of trust is essential for combating misbeliefs.
Because when we trust each other, we're more likely to listen to each other and to consider different perspectives.
Exactly, and that's a much better foundation for solving problems and building a better future than suspicion division and mistrust.
Ariely uses a really interesting analogy to illustrate this point. He compares humans to Superman.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. He talks about how Superman has all these superpowers, strength, speed, flight, X-ray vision that make him almost invincible.
While humans are comparatively weak and vulnerable.
Right. But Ariely points out that we've overcome these limitations by inventing technologies that augment our abilities.
Like cars for transportation, eyeglasses for vision, and even social media for communication.
Exactly. And he argues that we need to take a similar approach to our cognitive limitations.
We need to develop tools and strategies that help us make better decisions in a complex world.
Because we can't expect everyone to be perfectly rational all the time. We're human, not superheroes.
Precisely. And acknowledging our limitations is the first step towards finding solutions.
So it's not about becoming Superman. It's about finding ways to augment our own humanity.
That's an empowering thought.
It really is. It's about recognizing that we have this incredible capacity for both reason and delusion.
And that we need to be aware of both.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, one thing that I kept thinking about as I was reading Misbelief was like, okay, so what's the big deal? Why should we even care about misbeliefs?
Yeah, I mean, some of them seem kind of harmless, like the whole birds aren't real thing.
Right. But Ariely argues that misbeliefs aren't just harmless quirks. They can have real consequences.
Yeah, I can see that. Like if you believe that vaccines are dangerous, you might not get vaccinated, and that could put your health at risk.
Exactly. Or if you believe that climate change is a hoax, you might not support policies to address it. And that could have serious consequences for the planet.
So misbeliefs can impact our personal lives and our collective future.
Absolutely. And they can erode trust in institutions, which makes it even harder to solve problems.
Like we're all living in different realities.
Right. And Ariely is particularly concerned about the spread of what he calls alternative truths, these fabricated narratives that run parallel to evidence-based reality.
So it's not just about individual gullibility.
Mm.
It's about the system's instructions that amplify these misbeliefs.
Exactly. And he offers a few suggestions for how we can address this problem. He talks a lot about the importance of education, especially teaching critical thinking skills from a young age.
So giving people the tools to evaluate information effectively.
Right. And this education needs to go beyond traditional classrooms. We need to find creative ways to engage people in critical thinking, whether it's through games, social media campaigns, or even public art installations.
I like that idea, making critical thinking fun and engaging.
Exactly. And we also need to focus on media literacy, helping people understand how to identify bias, evaluate sources, and distinguish between fact and opinion.
Because it's not always easy to tell what's real and what's fake, especially online.
Right. Ariely also calls for structural changes to address the ways that social media platforms are designed to amplify misinformation. He suggests implementing algorithms that prioritize accuracy and diversity of viewpoints.
So kind of like rethinking the way these platforms are built.
Exactly. And he advocates for fact-checking initiatives, transparency measures, and greater accountability from tech companies.
So holding these companies responsible for the spread of misinformation.
Right. Ultimately, he believes that combating misbeliefs requires a collective effort.
It's not something that any one person or organization can solve on their own.
Exactly. It's a team effort involving tech companies, policymakers, journalists, educators, and even everyday citizens.
It sounds like a daunting task.
It is. But Ariely reminds us that it's not insurmountable. He believes that we can find solutions, but it requires recognizing our shared humanity, acknowledging our limitations, and working together to build a more informed and resilient world.
Well said. So if you're intrigued by this topic and you want to learn more about the psychology of misbeliefs, we highly recommend checking out Dan Ariely's book, Misbelief: What Makes Rational People Believe Irrational Things. It's a fascinating and timely read that will make you think twice about the information you encounter.
It's definitely a book that will stay with you.
And that's it for this deep dive into the world of misbeliefs. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another exploration of the human mind.
See you then.